But I think now it's only fair to give the two of you the chance to respond to one another. If there is any remaining issue that bothers you, either of you, about what the other said, maybe you want to challenge what Olli said, maybe Olli wants to challenge what Mikko said, whatever. We could use a few minutes on that and then give the floor to the audience.
First of all, I probably should say that I'm not that...
Might be a good idea, by the way, for both of you to come to the front.
I didn't want to follow the strategy that Olli was saying, that I first of all think that ecology is the superior science, and then I used these strawman arguments to shut down economists. That wasn't my purpose. My purpose was to some extent be provocative and provoke some discussions. That's why I was so sometimes perhaps harsher than I think in reality. But to some extent I tend to agree, particularly with the solutions that Olli came up with. We should work in closer contact with social scientists, particularly if we are studying questions like related to natural resource use, because natural resource problems and questions cannot be solved, I think, based on economic or ecological analysis alone. We need collaboration, definitely.
I guess one of your main concern was discounting and the question how we can take the future generations in economics into account, and that's of course one very common argument against economics in this context, and I guess in many other contexts. But the fact is that if we take the, let's say, basic economic model for optimal economic growth, it's neoclassical. So the troll is now here. It's the neoclassical model for optimal economic growth. It's published, I guess, 1928 by Frank Ramsey. He was very interesting figure. He was the friend of Wittgenstein, Keynes, and Bernard Russell. He was, in a sense, the first translator of Wittgenstein Tractatus from German to English. So he was working in Cambridge, UK. Okay, he presented the first neoclassical optimal growth model, and in that model it's still completely valid and used in economics. And in that model it's very easy to take all future generations equally. So all generations can be taken equally in that model, but still we may have discounting. For example, 4%. Why is that? The reason is that if rate of return to capital investments is possible, then €1 now is more valuable than €1 10 years from now because of capital productivity and positive rate of return. Another explanation is that if the prediction is that future generations are better off compared to us, then it's sensible to give lower weight to extra consumption in the future compared to extra consumption now. So even the basic old framework takes all generations equally, but still we have discounting. However, the fact is that, let's say, during the last 10 years, economists, they have worked a lot with this issue because of climate change. And now it's perhaps more clearly explained than earlier that in economic models, the interest rate may go down over time. So if it's now 4%, it may be 1% after 100 years. And this makes big difference in climate change context and also in biodiversity context. And what sounds very surprising perhaps is that it's fully possible that interest rate may be negative. So in that case, we put higher weight to future, to welfare of future generations, or consumption in some future moment compared to present moment. And that may happen, for example, if let's say, environmental quality goes down and consumption goes down. So the dynamic economic reasoning is much more general than normally understood, and that's in a sense that this type of theoretical discussion it's very common now in economic journals, and I think these interpretations should answer that question.
So basically you're saying that this resilience concept is already taken into account in economic analysis of environment.
Okay, I think this resilience concept is a little bit different. The resilience concept, if I understand it correctly, the situation is such that I guess this is the way how it's often described. We have this type of situation. We have this is a ball here. And if we push the ball a little bit, it comes back if we don't push it too hard. But if we push it too hard, it goes here. It goes here, and now when it's here, it's very hard to get it back here. And if this is, let's say, speaking, environmental quality, then this is good environmental quality here, this is bad environmental quality here, and if our emission level, for example, or over-exploitation of the fish population is too high, then we may get here. And okay, the question is, can we take this into account in economics? The answer is yes. There are, I say, 50 papers published on this. I don't. At least 50 papers have been published. I studied this myself 20 years ago, and it's very interesting issue, but it can be taken into account at the scientific level. Okay, practice, environmental policy practice is of course totally different question.
I think this last point is extremely important, and it occurred to me earlier too that what you find in textbooks, what you find in economics education, what you find in policy applications might be entirely different from what you find on the front line of inquiry. Avant-gardist work done by some inventive, innovative scholars or scientists. I think there's a major difference here, and when we're making these claims about what this discipline is all about, etc., disciplinary conventions, prevailing convictions and all that, you need to make this distinction between the front line of inquiry on the one hand and the main body of research and applications on the other. But I think there might be some conflation between these two also. Something that we
that's my interpretation as well, that the conflict is not between ecology and economics. It is between how people and politicians and decision makers apply and perceive these two sciences. Okay. Do you agree?
Yes, I guess that's quite correct.
Let me add a historical dimension here to this, because I think it's rather interesting. Mikko started out with citing Ernst Haeckel. 1870, ecology deals with the economy of nature, total relations of the animal to its inorganic and organic environment. And then you proceeded to cite Lionel Robbins in 1932-35, this idea of economics being about being the study of the allocation of scarce resources between competing ends in the market context. Now there is a difference of 60 years between these two, and actually economics had changed quite dramatically in between. So you don't have the same economics in 1870 and in the 1930s. So you can't really compare ecology and economics as if economics were a constant, historical constant. Actually, the 19th century economics was far more a systems science, something that it actually might be close to the aspirations of ecology, than was the Robbinsian depiction of economics, which was far more individualistic in its outlook, and a sort of the market played a major role in this image of economics. So this is another, the historical dimension is also very important when we talk about what this or that discipline is all about.
But isn't it interesting that Heckel's definition already included economics?
Maybe for wrong reason. I mean, he didn't really mean economics in our sense.
Yeah. But there's another thing that, I mean, the list of these similarities and parallels and also interactions between ecology and economics that Olli provided, very, very interesting and nice and exciting. But this created in my mind a kind of thought experiment, speculation of how these two disciplines might have evolved had they evolved independent from one another in a total ignorance of what happened in the other discipline. Will they still be similar in those ways? I'm not in favor of a sort of disciplinary insularity in general, but yet this might be an interesting thought experiment, especially when thinking of what kind of evidence we find in these parallels regarding these two domains and how to appropriately study the two domains, the human economy and then the ecology. The similarities just by themselves don't show much yet.
I guess in that case of game theory, the interaction and how ideas have been transferred between the disciplines, that's, I guess it's known very well because it's quite recent, about 70 years old development or less, so that's known quite well. But it comes, for example, to optimal correcting theory from the economic point of view, it looks just as an economic simple or not so simple, but economic optimization model. But I'm not fully aware how ecologists discovered or developed that theory. Did they have economics in their mind, or did they just discover similar structure themselves? I don't know it so well.
I would say that optimality as such is not an economic or ecological term, it's more general than that. So there's a common background.
Yeah. One implication of that is that mathematics is very important in science, let's say, between these fields, or a very important common method that often makes cooperation easier than optimization is in a sense accepted in both fields, then it's quite easy to cooperate.
Okay, let's listen to the audience. The floor is yours for comments, questions.
Well, a couple of comments. I start with a small point about the similarities. Olli, you had on your slide, you had the contrast between, not the contrast, but the parallel between human overexploitation of resources and then a virus overexploiting a bacterium, which I object. I don't see that as a meaningful concept or notion. And the solution then to that seeming problem is king selection, which again is not a solution to any biologically meaningful problem. There simply is no, as far as I can see, any overexploitation in non-human nature. I agree with everybody that I don't think there's any conflict between the disciplines of economics and ecology. I think the conflict which we are thinking, or at least most people are thinking, is between how the world is run economically by the stakeholders and states and such, and how then those interest groups, which may include ecologists who are concerned about the use of natural resources, how they think the world is run badly. Take a recent example of Arctic oil drilling. There clearly is an issue here of whether we are thinking of the short-term economic benefits for a nation like Finland if we are engaged in Arctic oil drilling versus then the predicted long-term problems which are caused by worsening climate change due to these activities. But again here I don't think it's really a conflict between how the economies are run and how we consider or to think about the use of natural resources. Take an example, for instance, preventive health care or poverty reduction in our society. It would probably make good economic sense to do that. But it's only that you need to have some sort of discount rate which is not applied at the present time to make sort of to have a policy which would be, as far as I can see, would be economically sensible in the long term. And I have a question to Olli about this negative interest rate. I just wonder, I mean, it's an interesting issue, and in some sense, maybe that would be the solution. But what really would happen if negative interest rate would be adapted by not only academic economists, but world leaders? It's the kind of principle.
Answer this. Okay, it's an interesting question. If my bank told me that interest rate is negative, I will take very, very big loan immediately, because I don't have to pay it back totally. So it cannot be any economic equilibrium in the long run, at least. But what will happen? I guess the idea is that if the prediction is such that capital productivity or rate of return on investments will go down, and if environmental quality in the future will go down, then if we do the economic optimization exercise, the interpretation is that in the long run interest rate may be negative, and then we put higher weight to future, to extra consumption or extra environmental quality in the future compared to the weight now. That's the implication. So we must invest a lot to environmental production and perhaps decrease our consumption level. That's the implication.
Yeah, well, I mean, would market economy kind of survive as we know it?
No. This is what government should do. Market economy don't take into account of environmental problems. We need government that corrects the tragedy of the commons. That's completely clear, and I guess almost all economists must accept that nowadays. But I may answer this viruses overexploiting bacteria question. I took the figures and the idea from a paper by Hanna Kokko, and if I understood correctly, the idea is that, for example, in this figure, those viruses, they are exploiting the bacteria too fast. It's too fast if we consider their, let's say, gain, their common gain. From the point of view of their common gain, they exploit it too fast. And that's the tragedy of the commons, just similar tragedy we have in the original Hardin paper from 1968. So that's how Hanna Kokko explains, she's an ecologist, very well-known ecologist. That's how he explained tragedy of the commons within non-humans. And according to Hanna Kokko, insects like ants and bees, they use punishment. They punish free riders, so that free riders act for the common good, not selfishly. That's the story by Hanna Kokko. I found it very, very interesting, but I'm just an economist.
So basically, the idea of negative interest rate is is fairly well developed in economics, but are you arguing that it's political decision to apply different interest rates to environmental goods than to, let's say, monetary stocks that we have?
Yes, if we are discussing about problems like climate change and biodiversity, then markets don't work. That's the basic economic result. From 1920s by Mikko, another economist from Cambridge. Market cannot be trusted here, and government should apply environmental policy and pollution taxes or marketable emission permits or this type of measures, and when they then decide the level of emission taxes, they should take into account long-term effects. And if the prediction is that consumption will go down and rate of return on capital will go down, then they should, from the economic point of view, apply negative interest rate. That's very recent. I don't know whether it's new result, but it's a little bit new interpretation, and it has been published in, let's say, the one main theoretical journal in economics. This is mainstream, really mainstream journal of economic theory. It was published in that journal, and it's very mainstream understanding.
To me, that seems to suggest that the critics towards this ecosystem service valuation is valid then. We cannot solve the problem of ecosystem functioning and biodiversity maintenance by markets only. We need political decision, we need political incentives.
Yes, of course.
It's not, the economic analysis is not the solution.
You now, your interpretation in economic analysis is now very narrow. Economics is much wider than only markets and market values, so it's too narrow. We have public goods, it's a very old idea, common property resources and so on. So that's very, I guess, quite typical argument or understanding that economics considers only market goods. That's not at all issue.
It actually relates to the earlier issue that we briefly discussed, namely what exactly do we find in a discipline such as economics, and what represents this discipline better than some other things. The discipline probably contains a huge array of theoretical resources, possibilities for further inquiry, possibilities for creating new models, etc. And most of those resources, or much of those resources, are never implemented in that way. Only part of those resources are actually applied and put forward in that way. And then what determines the actual implementations of those resources, their actualizations, is then a matter of various kinds of academic institutional forces, but also extra-academic political institutional forces and all that. And then it doesn't necessarily matter much if you find, even in a leading journal, a mathematical article or a few of those that are exploiting those theoretical resources in ways that are very different from what is expected, for instance, by policymakers from this discipline. And this actually brings us to another question, namely how ecology and economics are institutionally positioned in regard to policy and policy making. I think economics is so much closer. It has a privileged position in speaking to policymakers compared to ecologists. And I think this might have very, very interesting consequences and also a possibility for those political expectations to have a shaping effect on how those vast theoretical resources in economics are actually implemented in academic economics. But we have a question.
I just want to respond to what Mikko said. Isn't it though that in a functional democracy, the political response is in a way our response to the salience of the issue? So we are electing the people who are making political decisions, and we are electing the people who prioritize economics over environmental concerns. I mean, theoretically, I mean, it's very
Very
very general, but I mean, if you then want to change that or improve the environmental position, isn't it our responsibility then to forward that sort of an agenda? I mean, as people within this democratic society. So I guess I just didn't understand why it would be placed on the politicians to kind of forward this agenda. We need to create political salience, or the salience needs to be improved amongst people who are elected in the college.
Most voters are completely uninformed about these matters at all.
Yes.
They only role in the decision making in votes, casting their votes. But Katarina has a question.
Yeah, I want to push a bit on the difference between economics and ecology. It seems that now we are coming to, okay, but then they're not so different, it's just how people receive them or listen to them. But I'm not 100% convinced. And one of the ways in which I'd like you to push is in this example of resilience. And so you were saying resilience is important in ecology, but it's not like a tool or a concept that's so much important in economics. And then Olli said, oh no, but isn't that resilience? And he drew that graph in the blackboard. But I would think that the difference is, if there is a difference, I'm not sure, I don't know, and that's what I would like you to tell me, is what economists take to be the important factors that determine the resilience of an ecosystem vis-a-vis what ecologists take to be the important factors that determine the resilience of an ecological system. And yeah, the reason being is that maybe there are things that are like superficially similar, but then, I mean, at a closer look, there might be differences in what are, for instance, the causal relationships that are theorized in one discipline rather than another. So the fact that there are similar concepts and similar mathematical structures or what have you doesn't make it very close to one another, or at least. Yeah. So it's a question to both of you, because I don't know what each of the disciplines take to be the reasons. What lies behind resilience?
Yeah, well, speaking about this resilience and the definition of resilience, I don't think there are two separate definitions of it. And your question was, are there differences in factors that might be important for resilience? If we talk about resilience of the ecosystem, I don't think that the factors can be different in different. Ecosystem is resilient because certain rules apply or certain conditions apply. And I don't think that those factors or drivers differ, whether you look at those things from different angles. They are kind of a natural science part of it.
So the reason why you didn't know about the articles about the resilience is just that they don't
perhaps that's just my ignorance. I'm not that familiar of the economic literature on resilience.
Sorry.
Okay, one let's say policy type of concept ecologists often use in this context is the precautionary principle. And in economics we may not have, at least in mainstream economics, we may not use that word, but we use the word option value. And according to some authors in this area, these two concepts are, let's say, practically very similar. So precautionary principle in ecology, or actually applied ecology and option value in economics, they lead to similar policy instructions. That's also quite interesting. But I would like to mention one issue that may make difference. It's a little bit related to this resilience issue. It's a question on values how we get values to our, say, models or our thinking. There is some kind of resilience society somewhere, and they strongly oppose economics. And I guess the reason is that they don't accept the, let's say, ethical principles we apply in mainstream economics. It's utilitarianism that we are applying, and they don't accept that. They would like to apply different type of ethical approach. And in your slides, you also mentioned that ecology is non-anthropogenic, and economics is anthropogenic. In economics, all values, they come from the preferences of consumers or citizens, and that's the origin of all preferences. And I felt that in your presentation, you, in a sense, questioned that a couple of times. Is this correct understanding?
Yes, and I think that's more philosophical question than just related to ecology versus economics.
I think that's one very important, let's say, reason why economists and ecologists disagree. Different ethical understanding and principles.
I would think that's really a major issue in this idea of preference-based valuation. That can be easily disputed, and it should be disputed, and it should be an issue also in a wider interdisciplinary conversation. We are short of time, but there are two more people wishing to comment, and if you want to make a comment, please make it short. Janne, you hopefully will be first.
Okay, thanks. It's short. You may comment on this, but I understand that it's interesting to listen to Olli Tahvonen in the context that there's, my interpretation is that the power structures today are basically presenting a distorted or a one-sided view of the broad field of economics, and that's kind of interesting. And particularly in light of the recent developments, for example, in biodiversity conservation, there's a movement going on where we're establishing an international panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and within it there's an explicit effort to integrate scientific advice of ecology into the decision-making structure. And I'd just like to hear your speculation about which distorted version of ecology shall we see in the politics of ecosystems in the future. I'm sort of jumping out, I'm sort of assuming that if the process is the same as in economics, that we'll choose one particular version of economics that dominates decision making. Are there elements in ecology that might be particularly alluring?
Yeah, well, if we take very narrow approach to ecosystem services and only look at the valuable values and as they are defined now, the kind of current values from ecosystem services, that will definitely lead to a situation where we put into risk large part of biodiversity, because only, as I showed or said, only part of the species are valuable at the moment, and so perhaps 90% of the species can go if we take that very narrow economic valuation approach to ecosystem services. That's perhaps the largest risk I see.
My comment is still related. I'm thinking that, well, when economics is applied in societal decision making concerning natural things, it's usually in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And then Mönkönen's criticism seems to be that, okay, this analysis only takes into account the kinds of species that matter for individual people. And only they are valued, but there is no consideration given to sustainability or biodiversity as such. And therefore, at least what I have seen is that ecologists have mainly criticized the whole method and sort of tried to dump it all together and say we shouldn't look at those cost-benefit analysis at all because it's fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. Now, well, as I see it, you can do two things. You can continue this line, or you can go and influence the economists such that they would tune their cost-benefit analysis a bit.
May I answer or comment? Okay, economists, they are not so silly after all. If ecologists can show that all these species are somehow essential from the point of view of sustainability, of course, cost-benefit analysis or economics must take that into account. It's self-evident. Of course, some citizens may not understand it, but the idea is that when economists get the values from citizens, those citizens are well informed. Otherwise, it's nonsense to take their values seriously. They must be well informed.
They are not.
And if ecologists can show that these species are essential, although we don't see just now in what sense and why, but if they can give good arguments, it must be taken into account in cost-benefit analysis and economics. Otherwise, it's nonsense cost-benefit analysis. It's in a sense self-evident.
Yeah, I would say along the same lines that cost-benefit analysis, the problem with the cost-benefit analysis is that at the moment we are not probably able to measure benefits to their full extent.
Okay, then in economics we take into account the option value of these species, and you argue that we should apply precautionary principle. It's more or less same. But okay, I would still like to repeat the idea that one problem with ecology and economics is this value question, philosophical value question. I'm not expert in that area, but according to my understanding, that's one question we can perhaps not settle immediately. It's very difficult.
I would say that the conflict is between economic approach and how economists tend to deal with so-called intrinsic value. Value that people are able to give things, environment, regardless of the economic value. That's perhaps the divide, not between ecology and economics. How to deal with intrinsic value. If there's nobody to give that value, do we still have value? No humans to give that value. Do those values exist or not?
Well, as we all see, this is an all too big set of issues for an hour and a half or even a bit more. And I think the conclusion is that not only to thank the two speakers for very nice insights, but also that we will organize follow-up sessions on these related issues in the future. Thanks also to the audience.